When Alara Voss was 11 years old, she watched her mother's coffin disappear into the earth on a Tuesday morning in March, and by Thursday afternoon she was sitting on a plastic chair in the county social services office with a garbage bag full of clothes between her knees and no one in the world who wanted her. Her father had left before she could remember his face. Her mother, Claire, had worked double shifts at a laundromat in Harlan County, Kentucky, pressing other people's shirts until the cancer pressed back harder. And the only thing Claire Voss left behind, besides a daughter with tangled brown hair and a heart full of silence, was a handwritten note folded inside an envelope that read, in shaking cursive, "For Alara, when she is ready." The social worker put the envelope in a manila folder. The manila folder went into a filing cabinet, and Alara went into the foster system. She would not see that envelope again for 17 years. By the time Alara turned 28, she had lived in 9 foster homes across 3 states. She had slept on couches that smelled like cigarette ash and dog hair. She had learned to cook eggs at 7 in the morning for children who were not her siblings in kitchens that were not her own. She had put herself through community college by cleaning office buildings at night, scrubbing toilets with rubber gloves that were always too big for her hands, and she had exactly $412 in a savings account at a credit union in Lexington when the letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, forwarded 6 times through old addresses, the edges soft and gray from handling. Inside was a single type page from an attorney named Dale Hutchins in a town called Calvary Hollow, West Virginia. The letter said that her maternal grandmother, a woman named Marguerite Linden, had died 14 months earlier, that Marguerite had owned a property, that the property had been condemned, put up for tax auction, and purchased by the county for back taxes totaling $387, that no one had claimed it, and that buried in the old Harlan County files, someone had finally found Claire Voss's note, the one from the envelope, the one Alara had never been allowed to read. The note said only this: "The cathedral is yours. She will know what it means." Alara read those words 6 times in a laundromat parking lot, standing next to a shopping cart full of someone else's comforters, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she did not have a name for. She had never met her grandmother. She had never heard her mother mention a cathedral, but the attorney's letter included a property deed for a structure identified as former Mount Zion Congregational Church, built in 1891, sealed by county order in 2003, located on 4.5 acres of wooded hillside, 11 miles outside of Calvary Hollow. The purchase price to transfer the deed into Alara's name, including all outstanding fees, was $400 even. She would have $12 left. She drove to West Virginia in a borrowed car with a cracked windshield and a heater that only worked on the driver's side. The last 11 miles were gravel, then dirt, then something that was barely a road at all, just 2 tire tracks through knee-high grass with blackberry brambles scratching the doors. It was early October, and the trees on the hillside were turning copper and blood red, and the sky was the color of old pewter. And when the road finally opened into a clearing, Alara stopped the car and sat there for a long time without moving. The cathedral stood at the top of a gentle slope, half swallowed by ivy and Virginia creeper. It was not enormous, not the kind you see in cities with flying buttresses and tourists. It was a country cathedral built from hand-cut limestone blocks that had gone gray and green with lichen, but it had a real bell tower, square and solid, rising 40 feet above the tree line. It had tall arched windows, 12 of them, boarded over with plywood that had warped and buckled with decades of rain. The front doors were massive, dark oak, chained shut with a padlock so rusted it looked like it had grown there, like a barnacle on the hull of a ship. Weeds had pushed through the stone steps. A bird was nesting in a crack above the lintel, and on the cornerstone, carved in deep block letters, were the words, "Mount Zion, 1891. Alara stepped out of the car. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold stone, and something faintly sweet like old wood remembering the sun. She could hear the wind moving through the bell tower, a low, hollow moan, and somewhere behind the building, a creek running over rocks. She walked up the steps. She put her hand in the door. The oak was rough under her palm, swollen with moisture, and she could feel the cold of the stone wall radiating through the air beside her. The padlock broke on the third hit with a tire iron. The chain fell away with a sound like bone settling, and the doors swung inward on hinges that screamed in protest. A long, agonized shriek of metal that sent birds exploding from the bell tower above. Alara stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The smell hit her first. Dust so thick it had a texture, a dry, powdery weight that settled on her tongue and the back of her throat. Underneath it, the ghost of incense, wood polish, candle wax, and something else, something alive, the green mineral scent of water seeping through stone. Dim gray light filtered through gaps in the plywood, cutting the darkness into slanted columns filled with floating particles. The floor was wide planked pine, warped in places, covered in a fur of dust and fallen plaster. Pews stood in 2 rows, still upright, draped in cobwebs so thick they looked like gauze curtains. At the far end, the nave opened into a raised chancel with a stone altar, and behind the altar, rising all the way to the vaulted ceiling, stood a pipe organ. It was enormous, easily 30 feet tall, with hundreds of pipes arranged in graduated rows, the largest ones as thick as Alara's waist, the smallest thinner than her finger. The pipes were tarnished silver and verdigris green, and the wooden casing around them was carved with grapevines and wheat sheaves and what looked like small birds in flight. The console sat below, a 3-manual keyboard with ivory keys gone yellow as old teeth, and pedals crusted with dust. Alara walked down the center aisle. Her footsteps echoed. She reached the organ and ran her fingers across the keys without pressing them. The ivory was cold and smooth. She looked up at those pipes and felt a vertigo that had nothing to do with height. She felt like she was standing inside her mother's silence. All the things Claire had never said, all the stories she had never told, and those pipes were holding the shape of that silence, preserving it, waiting. She spent that first night in the car wrapped in a sleeping bag she had bought at a thrift store for $3, eating peanut butter from the jar with a plastic spoon. The temperature dropped to 31 degrees. She could see her breath through the windshield. The cathedral was a black shape against the stars, and the bell tower looked like a finger pointing at something she could not yet name. In the morning, she went back inside. She had a flashlight now, and a notebook, and she walked every inch of the building. The nave was sound. The roof had leaked in 2 places, leaving stains on the ceiling like brown continents on a plaster map, but the beams above were solid chestnut, and when she knocked on them with her knuckles, they rang back hard and true. The side rooms were small, a vestry with empty coat hooks and a cracked mirror, a storage closet filled with cardboard boxes that had dissolved into pulp, a narrow staircase leading up to the bell tower, and behind the organ, a door she almost missed because it was the same color as the wall. It was locked, not with a padlock, but with a deadbolt, and the deadbolt was brass, not rusted, which meant someone had installed it long after the church was sealed. Alara stared at that door. She pressed her ear against it and heard nothing. She tried the handle. It did not move. She left it for now. There were more urgent things, like the fact that she had $12, no job, no running water, no electricity, and was living in a condemned building in a town where she knew no one. The first person she met in Calvary Hollow was a man named Burl Tackett, who ran the hardware store and the post office out of the same building. He was 73 years old, with hands like baseball mitts and a voice like gravel in a coffee can. When Alara walked in and asked if anyone knew about the old church on the hill, Burl looked at her for a long moment and said, "You must be Marguerite's girl." She told him she was Marguerite's granddaughter. He shook his head. "No," he said. "You have her eyes. You are her girl." And then he told her things. He told her that Marguerite Linden had been the organist at Mount Zion for 41 years, from 1960 until the congregation dissolved in 2003. That she had played every Sunday, every wedding, every funeral. That she could make that organ sound like a thunderstorm or a lullaby or a human voice calling out in the dark. That people used to drive from 3 counties away just to hear her play on Easter morning. He told her that Marguerite had a daughter named Claire who left Calvary Hollow at 17 and never came back, and that Marguerite never spoke of why, but she played differently after that. Sadder, longer, like she was playing for someone who was no longer in the room. He told her that Marguerite had tried to buy the church when the congregation dissolved but could not afford it, that she had gone to the county board, written letters, begged, that they sealed it anyway, and that she spent the last 20 years of her life in a trailer half a mile down the hill, close enough to see the bell tower from her kitchen window, keeping watch over a building she could no longer enter. Alara's throat was tight when she asked why her mother had left. Burl looked out the window for a long time. There was a man, he said finally. Your grandfather. He was not kind. He is buried in the cemetery behind the church, and Marguerite never once visited the grave. That is all I will say. That night, Alara sat on a pew in the cathedral with Burl's words circling in her head. Her mother had fled this place. Her grandmother had stayed and endured. And neither of them had told Alara the truth. Not about the cathedral, not about the family, not about any of it until it was too late to ask questions. She felt a slow, cold anger build in her chest. At her mother for dying, at her grandmother for never reaching out, at the system that had swallowed her whole for 17 years, at a grandfather she never knew who had been, in Burl's careful words, not kind. She wanted to walk away. She almost did. She stood up, and her knee bumped the pew in front of her, and the sound traveled through the empty building like a heartbeat, and in the silence that followed, she heard something. A note, a single sustained note, low and resonant, coming from the organ. She stopped breathing. The organ had no power. No electricity ran to this building. She walked toward the chancel, her flashlight beam shaking in her hand, and the note faded, slowly, the way a bell fades after it has been struck, not stopping so much as dissolving into the silence. She reached the console. No one was there. The key sat untouched under their layer of dust. She looked at the pipes rising above her in the darkness, and she could not explain what she had heard, and she did not try. She sat down on the organ bench and placed her fingers on the keys, lightly, the way you touch the face of someone who is sleeping. And she decided to stay. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of her life, and Alara's life had been nothing but hard weeks. She had no money for a contractor, so she became one. She cleared debris with her hands, filling garbage bags, until her fingers bled through her work gloves. She patched the roof leaks with tar paper and roofing cement she bought on credit from Burl, who waved away her promises to pay and told her Marguerite would haunt him if he charged her full price. She pulled the plywood from the windows one board at a time, and as each window was uncovered, the light changed inside the cathedral, shifting and growing like something waking up. Behind the plywood, the windows were stained glass. Not broken, not faded. 12 panels depicting 12 scenes, and they were stunning. Cobalt blue and ruby red and emerald green and amber gold, with leading so fine it looked like pencil lines. The morning sun came through the east windows and threw colored light across the floor in pools so vivid they looked wet. Alara stood in the middle of them and felt warmth on her skin that had nothing to do with temperature. But not everyone was glad to see the cathedral coming back to life. A county inspector showed up on day 9 with a clipboard and a frown and told her the building was condemned and she was trespassing on county property. She showed him the deed. He said the deed did not matter if the building was structurally unsound. He said he would need to see permits, engineering reports, and insurance before she could legally occupy the structure. The fines for noncompliance started at $500 per day. $500 a day. Alara had $9.60. She called the attorney, Dale Hutchins, who told her he was retired and could not help, but gave her the number of a legal aid office in Charleston that might. She called the legal aid office and was told her case was not a priority. She called the county board and was put on hold for 40 minutes and then disconnected. She sat on the front steps of the cathedral with the phone in her lap and the copper trees blazing on the hillside around her, and thought about every plastic chair in every social services office she had ever sat in, every adult who had told her to wait, to be patient, to trust the process, while the process ground her down like grain between stones. She thought about her mother pressing shirts. She thought about her grandmother watching the bell tower from a trailer window. 3 generations of women waiting. For what? She went back inside and started working again. By the end of the first month, she had cleaned the nave, repaired 7 pews, sealed the roof, and run a garden hose from the creek to a plastic barrel outside the front door for washing water. She cooked on a camp stove in the vestry. She slept in a sleeping bag on the chancel floor, near the organ, because it was the warmest spot in the building, sheltered from drafts by the massive pipe structure above. She found work in town, waitressing at a diner called the Copper Kettle for $6.50 an hour plus tips, and every cent that did not go to food went into the cathedral. On the 5th week, a woman named Agnes Pruitt walked in without knocking. She was 81 years old, 4'11", with white hair pinned up in a bun so tight it looked structural, and she carried a casserole dish wrapped in a towel. She set it on the altar without ceremony and said, "I sang in the choir here for 26 years. If you are going to bring this place back, you will need to eat something besides peanut butter." The casserole was chicken and dumplings. Alara ate it standing up with a plastic fork and cried so hard she had to sit down, not because she was sad, but because she could not remember the last time someone had cooked for her. Agnes came back the next day, and the next, and she brought others. Bro came with tools and lumber. A man named Erwin Skaggs, who had been a deacon at Mount Zion, came with buckets of white paint and a lifetime of stories about the church. A teenager named Josie, who lived in a foster home in town and reminded Alara so much of herself that it made her chest ache, started showing up after school to help sand the pews. Slowly, without any plan or announcement, Calvary Hollow began to reclaim its cathedral. By the 3rd month, the nave was painted. By the 4th, the pews were restored. By the 5th, a retired electrician named Howard ran a proper power line from the road, and when the lights came on for the first time, the stained glass windows blazed with color so intense that Agnes, standing in the center of the nave, crossed herself and whispered the name of God. But the locked door behind the organ remained locked. Alara thought about it every night. She had tried a crowbar, a screwdriver, a hammer. The deadbolt held. She had looked for a key in every drawer, every box, every crack in the building. Nothing. And she had begun to notice something else. On the organ console, beneath the dust she had carefully cleaned away, there were scratches on the wood beside the lowest manual keyboard. Not random scratches, letters. Faint, as if carved with a fingernail or a pen, but legible if you angled the light just right. They spelled G-A-C-E. 4 letters, 4 notes. G-A-C-E. It was not a word. It was not a name. But it tugged at something deep in Alara's memory, something she could not quite reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue that dissolves when you try to say it. She sat at the organ one evening after the electricity was connected and pressed the power switch. Nothing happened. Howard had wired the lights and the outlets, but had not touched the organ's blower motor, which was a separate system entirely, a massive electric bellows that forced air through the pipes. He said it would need a specialist, someone who knew reed organs and pneumatics, and the nearest one was in Pittsburgh, and the estimate was $8,000. $8,000 might as well have been $8 million. But 2 weeks later, on a night when the first snow of the season was falling outside and the cathedral windows looked like dark jewels set in white velvet, Alara was sitting at the console running her fingers over the keys, as she did almost every evening, and she pressed G-A-C-E, 4 keys, in sequence, gently. And the organ played, not loudly, not the way it would have sounded with full power, but a breath of air moved through the pipes, impossibly, as if the building itself had exhaled, and the 4 notes rang out, thin and silver and heartbreaking, and they hung in the air of the cathedral like something holy, and Alara's hands began to shake because she knew that melody. She knew it the way she knew her own breathing, the way she knew the sound of her mother's voice saying goodnight in the dark. It was a lullaby. Her mother had hummed it to her every night for 11 years, 4 notes, repeating in a simple pattern, G, a C, E, and Alara had never known where it came from, had never asked, had assumed it was just something her mother made up. But those 4 notes were carved into this organ by a woman who had played it for 41 years, a woman who had a daughter named Claire, who had a daughter named Alara, and the lullaby was a key. She played the sequence again. G, A-C-E. And behind her she heard a click. She turned around. The locked door behind the organ had opened, not swung wide, just unlatched, drifting an inch inward on its hinges, as if it had been waiting for the right password all along. Alara picked up her flashlight. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She crossed the chancel and pushed the door open. Behind it was a room, small, maybe 10 feet by 12, with no windows. The walls were bare stone. The ceiling was low, and the room was full. There were journals, dozens of them stacked on shelves that lined every wall, leather-bound and cloth-bound, and some just spiral notebooks held together with rubber bands. There were photographs in frames, and photographs loose, black and white in color, spanning decades. There were letters bundled with ribbon. There were newspaper clippings, yellow and brittle, and on a small wooden table in the center of the room, under a glass dome like something in a museum, was a single object. It was a music box, brass about the size of a fist, with a tiny crank on the side and an engraving on the lid. Alara lifted the glass dome and picked it up. The engraving read, "For Claire, from your mother, who will always be playing for you." She turned the crank. The music box played G-A-C-E, the lullaby, the same 4 notes. And Alara understood. Her grandmother had made this room, had installed the deadbolt herself, had carved the notes into the organ console, had built a lock that could only be opened by someone who knew the song, someone who had heard Claire hum it, someone Claire loved enough to pass it on to. Marguerite had never been able to find her daughter. The foster system had swallowed Alara whole and left no trail. But Marguerite had built this room on faith, on the belief that someday someone in her bloodline would come here, would sit at the organ, and would play the only song that mattered. She had waited 20 years in a trailer down the hill watching the bell tower. She had died 14 months before Alara arrived, but she had left the door open, and the only way she knew how. Alara sat on the floor of that small stone room and opened the journals. She read all night. She read about Marguerite's marriage to a man named Edwin Linden, who drank and raged and broke things, including his wife's wrist in 1971 and her collarbone in 1978. She read about Claire growing up in that violence, learning to be quiet, learning to be small. She read about the night Claire left, age 17, climbing out a window with a suitcase and $40, and Marguerite standing at the kitchen sink watching her go, not stopping her, because leaving was the only gift Marguerite could give. She read about the years after. Marguerite playing the organ on Sundays with bruises under her sleeves. Edwin dying in 1985 alone and unmourned. Marguerite finally free at 52, spending the next 20 years pouring every ounce of her freed self into the church, into the music, into the hope that Claire would come back. She read about the letters Marguerite sent to every address she could find, return unopened, wrong address, no such person. She read about the day the church was sealed, and Marguerite stood on the front steps and wept like a child. And on the last page of the last journal, dated 3 weeks before Marguerite's death, she read this: "I do not know if anyone will ever read these words. I do not know if Claire is alive. I do not know if she had children. But I built this room the way I built everything in my life, with faith and without evidence. If you are reading this, you found the song. If you found the song, then Claire loved you enough to sing it. And if Claire loved you, then I love you too, even though I never held you, even though I never knew your name. Play the organ for me, just once. That is all I ask." The snow was still falling when Alara came out of the room. The cathedral was silent. The stained glass windows were black mirrors reflecting her flashlight back at her. She walked to the organ and sat down and placed her hands on the keys. And she did not know how to play, had never had a lesson in her life. But she pressed G-A, ah, C-E, Lu, and the organ breathed again that impossible thin breath, and the notes filled the cathedral the way water fills a glass. Rising from the bottom, and Alara played the lullaby her mother had hummed to her in the dark, over and over, 4 notes, the simplest song in the world, and it was enough. In the months that followed, things changed in ways Alara could not have predicted. A historian from the State University came to examine the stained glass windows and declared them the work of a German glassmaker named Friedrich Braun, who had emigrated to West Virginia in 1888 and whose surviving works were exceedingly rare. The 12 panels were appraised at over $200,000. The county inspector came back, this time without a frown, and the condemnation order was lifted. A grant from a historic preservation fund covered the organ restoration, and a specialist came from Pittsburgh and spent 3 weeks rebuilding the blower motor and tuning every one of the 437 pipes. On the day the organ was fully restored, Alara invited everyone in Calvary Hollow to the cathedral. Agnes came, and Burl and Irwin and Josie and Howard and 37 other people who remembered Mount Zion, or who had simply watched a young woman with tangled brown hair and bleeding fingers bring a building back from the dead. They sat in the restored pews under the blazing stained glass, and Alara stood at the console, and she could play more than 4 notes now because she had been teaching herself from her grandmother's journals, which contained detailed annotations of every piece Marguerite had ever performed. She played a hymn that Marguerite had played at the church's centennial celebration in 1991. The pipes filled the cathedral with a sound so deep and full that Agnes gripped the pew in front of her and wept openly. And Burl removed his hat, and Josie, sitting alone in the back row, closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her like warm water. And for a few minutes, no one in that building was orphaned or abandoned or betrayed or forgotten. They were just people, sitting together, listening. Alara did not turn the cathedral into a church again. She turned it into a home, her home. She built a kitchen in the vestry and a bedroom in the room behind the organ, the room Marguerite had filled with journals and photographs and a brass music box. She kept the nave open, with its pews and its stained glass and its organ, and on Sunday mornings she played for anyone who wanted to listen, and sometimes that was 20 people, and sometimes it was just Josie, and it did not matter. She framed one of the photographs from Marguerite's collection and hung it on the wall beside her bed. It showed a young woman, maybe 30, sitting at the organ console with her hands on the keys and her face turned slightly toward the camera, not quite smiling, but not quite smiling either, as if she knew a secret she was not yet ready to tell. On the back, in Marguerite's handwriting, it said "Myself, 1965, playing for Claire, who is sleeping in the vestry and does not know yet that music is a kind of love." Some nights, when the wind moves through the bell tower and the stained glass throws colored shadows on the floor in the moonlight, Alara sits at the organ and plays G, A, C, E. 4 notes, a lullaby, a password, a promise passed from a grandmother to a mother to a daughter, across decades of silence and separation and loss, surviving foster homes and filing cabinets and condemned buildings and death itself, carried in a melody so simple that a child could hum it in the dark. And every time she plays it, just for a moment, she feels 2 women standing behind her. One on each side, not ghosts, not memories, something closer than that. Something that does not need a name because it has always been there, in the space between the notes, waiting for her to sit down and listen. The cathedral still stands on that hillside 11 miles outside of Calvary Hollow. If you drive the gravel road in October, you can see the bell tower above the copper trees. And if you arrive on a Sunday morning and the windows are open and the wind is right, you can hear the organ playing. Not a hymn, not a symphony, just 4 notes repeating, the simplest song in the world. But if you listen closely, you will hear what Alara hears. That it is not simple at all, that those 4 notes contain 41 years of Sundays, and a mother climbing out a window at 17, and a woman pressing shirts until the cancer came, and an 11-year-old girl sitting in a plastic chair with a garbage bag full of clothes. That those 4 notes are the sound of a family finding each other across time, not through blood or proximity or even words, but through the only thing that can pass through locked doors and sealed buildings and the silence between the living and the dead. Music. Just music. Playing in a cathedral that costs $400 and is worth more than anything money can measure. Playing for anyone who needs to hear it. Playing still.